microscopic level, they exist to kill. They travel, they attack, they hide, they even gather together in defense maneuvers. Pathogens are the enemies of every member of the healthcare team. On Pathogens and PPE, we give you the tools you need to fight these threats and win. So sit back, tune in, and let's make these microbes tremble at the sound of your name.
Hey everybody, we're back with another episode of the Pathogens and PPE podcast. I'm Jill Holdsworth, Manager of Infection Prevention at Emory University Hospital Midtown in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm here with my awesome co-host, Paul, who's going to give you a little bit of info about himself.
Thank you, Jill. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Gentile, and I'm going to be co-hosting this podcast series with Jill Holdsworth, and I'm an infection preventionist at Yale New Haven Hospital, and I've been an IP for several years now and also worked with Jill.
I'm super excited to have Paul in the studio today because, like he said, we've known each other for a long time. We survived COVID together working here at the same hospital, and this is really exciting to be hosting this show together, all on PPE basics and sterile processing. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Pathogens and PPE podcast series, and I am here with my co-host Paul, and I'd like to welcome our two special guests, Marianne and Sharon, and I'm going to ask them to do a quick intro and let you know why they are so passionate about SPD and infection prevention. Marianne, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Hi, my name is Marianne. I am an nurse by trade originally, and then I transitioned into the infection control world because I sparked an interest one day, and I just ran with it. And then I sparked an interest in sterile processing when I became one of the auditors for the site. And ever since then, I hold a special part. It's in my heart. I love it. I love to kind of understand more about the processes and the people that work behind the scenes.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And Sharon, take it away.
So I am currently the Senior Clinical Education Specialist at Healthmark. I've been in the industry, afraid to say, over 30 years in SPD as well as the scrub tech. Very passionate about it, especially PPE, because I wore it most of my life. That's probably how I lost most of my hair from the cap or bouffant cap. But yeah, I just have a lot of passion for it. I love it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So Paul and I are here today to go through this episode that's going to be all about PPE basics in sterile processing. So this is obviously near and dear to my and Paul's heart because we are IPs by trade. This is really exciting for me to have Sharon on this show because we have been the AAMI Protective Barriers co-chairs together. And so I'm really excited to kind of dig into that too as we go through this podcast episode. So first I want to just kind of kick it off with an easy question. And I'll start off with Marianne, but why do you think PPE is so important when we're talking about sterile processing?
Well, PPE is important in many different aspects within the healthcare system. So I don't think that sterile processing is any different. If anything, they're really more important because they're handling things with patients that are unknown. So although you can anticipate when you're doing bedside care for a patient of what you're kind of getting into, when you're working in sterile processing, you really have no idea where the instruments or devices are coming from. So it's really important that we have that layer of protection for our employees while we're out there, while they're doing the work that they're doing in that space.
No, and that's great to hear, Marianne. People can definitely be exposed to any of these fluids that are capable of transmitting the disease. And like you said, the unknown, I think that's really important.
Sharon, how about you? What do you think about PPE in general and in sterile processing?
Wow. The first thing that comes to mind is just wearing it most of my life and all the things that have happened from rips and tears and being exposed from not wearing it correctly because I didn't know as a new technician, or being in procedures as scrub tech as well and being splattered because that's just the nature of the job in certain procedures, right? and just how important it really is. And of course, just early on in my career, there wasn't really much of a selection. And now today we see more, but we also see with that more of a selection, we're not selecting the right ones or we're not wearing it correctly. So.
And Marianne, I love what you said about you don't know what the fluids are from or who the fluids are from. And I've never really thought about this before, but it's almost like the emergency department, how we don't know who's coming into the emergency department and what disease that they have or what we need to protect ourselves from. And I've never, in my mind, compared sterile processing to the emergency department before, but really it is very similar because you have no idea what patient you're treating when you're treating those instruments. But really we should kind of think about it that way because you have to be ready for anything. And just like in the emergency room, you have no idea what's walking through that door. It could be Ebola. It could be something else, but you have to have well-fitting PPE and you have to know it. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as we go through the show. But that was so important, Sharon, what you said as well, that you were a new tech and you just didn't know and you weren't sure what to do. You weren't sure what to choose. And now we have so many things to choose from that sometimes that's good and bad. So that's such great lead-in questions for us to kind of get started here today. Paul, do you have anything to add?
No, I think, the ED is a great example. And I think, in terms of the PPE, I know in SPD, they use a variety of things more than I'm just thinking right now of a yellow gown. In the ED, we wear the yellow gowns, but I know in the SPD, we have different types of accessories that we use for PPE. So definitely touched on some pretty important points.
Yeah, no, super important to make sure that we're wearing the right thing. So that leads into my next question about collaboration so that we can wear the correct PPE. And this podcast is all about IP and SPD. So for both of you coming from both sides of the spectrum here, I'd like to understand just some brainstorming thoughts on how we can collaborate better from both sides, IP and SPD, so that we are choosing the right things for the right risks and making sure that we're using them correctly. And if you have any experiences on how that's been done well, or even if you've seen some things that haven't been done so well, but we could learn from. Sharon, I'd like to start with you.
I mean, the first thing that I remember comes to mind when you ask that question is I remember having, the mock surveys that we have with IP, but this one, I remember IP coming through and they had concerns with how we were wearing the PPE or the selection that we had wasn't enough. And they came back and they did a root cause or just a risk assessment, I guess. And it was so amazing because they really educated us on, wow, we just weren't wearing it right. And you've seen it where we'll have PPE and then it takes us 20 minutes to get ready because we're making holes with sharp scissors and then we're taping everything and we're making thumb loops and then we're making designs. It takes literally 20 minutes to get ready when it shouldn't have to be 20 minutes because we're going off the beaten path from the IFU. But having IP come and do that risk assessment and really watch the team of a couple things. One, do we have the right sizes? Because, everybody's a different size, right? And as well as having the right PPE in place. So that was the first thing that popped in my head. I remember that.
No, that's a great point, Sharon. I think, the risk assessment is a key part of this too. And I think as infection preventionists, we want to make sure that, that you are being supplied with the appropriate PPE to do your jobs and to prevent the risk of any blood or bodily fluid exposure while you're performing those tasks. So I think that's really important. What do you think, Jill?
Yeah, and I have heard this topic of having the right sizes in sterile processing come up multiple times over the last year. And I think this is really important because I don't think a lot of sterile processing departments put this as a priority. And I don't think that a lot of departments are making sure that they do have the right sizes, that they do have the right fit. And I think that we need to make sure that we provide some resources. And I love this idea of a risk assessment that IPs can perform specifically for sterile processing PPE. And I'd love if anybody's listening to this and that they have some examples of this that they'd be willing to share and use this as a resource that others can use as well. I think this is really important. And if you're a sterile processing person who has had one of these done on your department and you'd be willing to ask your IP for these examples, I think that would be great. This would be a great resource sharing and learning for all of us. Marianne, what do you think about collaboration? Have you seen any great examples or examples that you would rather learn from?
Well, first I wanted to kind of comment back on Sharon. I was thinking about how you were talking about making a hole and taping and doing all those extra steps. And I was always kind of taught, especially like in my former trade, was if it feels like you're doing too many steps or you're gathering too many things, there's probably something amiss. And, got to phone a friend. And your friend should be infection control. Your infection preventionist should be able to kind of help you and guide that. And I can also say that I know that it's not always a collaborative relationship. IPs tend to focus or tend to be more of an inpatient style where they kind of visit the floors and stuff. But I think it's important, those procedural areas, including sterile processing, are important to kind of have that collaboration. I'm just reflecting back when we had the supply chain shortages during COVID. And we had a lot of substitutions that came through. And although the substitutions might have been adequate for what we were doing at the bedside, they weren't always adequate for sterile processing. So one of the collaborative things that we did was we gathered a bunch of samples from various vendors and we brought them to the sterile processing team. And we said, hey, try these out. Let us know what you think about them, because their perception is going to be a little bit different than an OR tech or a surgeon or a bedside nurse or a physician. It doesn't matter. So because of that, we had to also take into consideration what you all were doing in sterile processing and the conditions that you're working under, which are completely different. You're wearing your PPE 24/7 in different, environments. It gets a little hot when you're doing all that work.
And Marianne, that's like a great test to change as well. I think, it's very important that infection preventionists definitely should be collaborating with their SPD. I think that's a part of our role and responsibility, is to have that dynamic partnership with our SPD, so we make sure that we're ensuring the right PPE is being provided to you guys.
And I think we learned a lot with COVID, and hopefully we learned a lot, that one size doesn't fit all. And just because we have a substitute doesn't mean that it works for everybody. And so I think that's a really great point, Marianne. And I'm going to just kind of divert just for a moment and ask for Sharon to give us just a brief summary of the change that went into effect last year with the AAMI PB70 guidelines and the new verbiage that went into that surrounding the decontamination gown and the new requirements, because this was such a pivotal change with PPE for the sterile processing world. And we spent a lot of time last year trying to spread this message. And I want to just take any opportunity that we can to make sure that everyone knows that this is in the AAMI PB70 standards document now. It is for the safety of everyone that works in a decontamination environment. So Sharon, do you mind summarizing just for a minute about that?
Sure. So there were numerous changes to the document, and there were, I would say, 4, if not 5, different types of protective barriers that were added. And one of them was an extended critical area for a surgical gown, as well as a procedural gown, and hoods and togas and a variety of stuff. But the big one that really applies to SPD was the decontamination gown. And that one was the biggest, besides labeling as well, for the packages to list that classification of barrier. But it was that decontamination gown that really, there was a minimum now. And the minimum was a level 3, or is a level 3. And that was somewhere to start. We never had anything close to that, right, Jill? And it now has a starting point for us, because if you've looked in decontam, you'll see isolation gowns, you'll see, I don't know, garbage bag. It's just all over the place. And now we have something to where there is at least a minimum level 3, or you can even use a 4, right? So those are the significant changes. Unless it was something else, Jill, that were wanting me to really touch on, but that was the biggest one.
Yeah, and some people would ask us, well, what can I do now? We don't have any gowns yet that are named decontamination gowns, and we would tell them at least go see if you're using a 3 or 4. That's what you can do today. Go to your department today and make sure you're wearing a 3 or 4, or that's what you have in stock. And if not, then make that happen at the very least. So that's something that you can do right now. That's just a basic PPE step to make sure that your decontamination staff are safe, and start reading the new guidelines. Make sure that you know what the updates are. And that's great. That's something that we can all do to make sure everybody is safe.
I like to add, too, that even TR 11, which is a guidance document for PB70, and Marianne brought up a good situation, is that when you're looking at evaluating gowns or reevaluating a gown, or reevaluating a gown because there's issues with it, that TR 11 does have a guide or a template to be able to use to track it correctly. Because a lot of times you'll ask the vendor for samples and they give you 3, 4, and you're supposed to dispense that out to 3 shifts. And you have so many different sizes, right? And I think that part of it will definitely help to really look at trends, and everybody's documenting, the technicians, the date, the issue, comfort, everything. So just wanted to throw that in there because that did ring a bell for me.
Yeah, and I think too, Sharon and Mary, you guys brought up good points. I think in terms of the PPE minimum requirements, at least now it sounds like it's being expanded too. So you're not just looking at one specific class, you can look at another too. So it's creating more options as well.
That's great. And that leads into my next topic I wanted to talk about. And it kind of goes into something we previously touched on, but really assessing the risks of our PPE failures. And when we talk about PPE failures, it can mean a whole lot of things. And then also, how do we escalate those? How do we track those? What are PPE failures in sterile processing, and what does that mean? And Marianne, I kind of want to talk to you about this first, because in the world of infection prevention, we may not always hear about PPE failures, but when we do, how can we help, and how do we help assess the risk, and then what do we do about it? So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I was just thinking about the term PPE failures, and you're right. I don't feel like we hear about them enough. The reason we normally hear about a PPE failure of any sort is typically by word of mouth. People are complaining, and then, or you hear the gossip, or you're doing a round, or you're just checking in with people, and then you'll hear it from almost like the grapevine. So I do think that there has to be a better way to report that. We do have a reporting structure format in my facility where you can send it in, but I don't think that staff stop to think, I'm going to go put in one of these safety events, when it really is a safety event. Because even though it's not a typical safety event that you would think, a PPE failure is a huge safety event, and it can impact other people that may be having the same issue in the institution, and we have no idea. We don't know how widespread is it. Is it just an isolated occurrence, or is it a bigger problem? And does it mean that we have to go and look at a new PPE, or whatever PPE form of PPE it is? Is it a gown? Is it a glove? Whatever it is, we need to know how isolated that problem is.
Yeah, Marianne, I think that's really paramount, especially in the SPD world as well, especially because, again, like I was saying earlier, you guys are dealing with blood and bodily fluids. You may not see it, but if you're starting to see breaches in your PPE, there needs to be a reporting structure for that. So I think that's very important. So at least if it is an issue that is, I would say, happening consistently, then we can figure out a way on how to address that.
It's so interesting to me because I feel if nurses or physicians were having PPE failures in the OR, or when they inserted a central line, or any of those things, and they got exposed, or if they got wet through their PPE, there would definitely be a safety event put in, and that's how we would know about it. But you're absolutely right, Marianne, when you say, how do we find out about these things? You might hear about it because you heard somebody complaining about it and you just happened to overhear it. You heard it by accident. So I feel like we need to normalize sterile processing being able to report these situations as safety events, just like a nurse would when it goes through their gown when they're doing some sort of procedure. And I'm not sure what the solution is. Maybe just continuing to talk about it and dialogue about it. We have another episode about bloodborne pathogen exposures, so we can talk about it there too. But we do need to normalize this so that the sterile processing world also knows that their safety is a priority and that PPE is a priority, and making sure that PPE works. And Sharon, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some of those failures that we're looking for. And I'm sure that you've had a myriad of failures yourself, and would love to know what you did or didn't do, or what maybe now, kind of thinking back over your career, maybe what you feel like you wish you would have done in escalation, or what you see happening now that you feel like is a best practice.
I think I'll definitely own that before I even got involved in PB70, I know I didn't do it the right way. And it was probably like everybody else, just rumors, word of mouth. It's always one shift that doesn't like a gown that's being evaluated, but you do it anyways. But I got to say that some of the things now, and I go back to the example product evaluation table that you could probably use to document a situation if there was a trend of tearing. And that one definitely stands out for me because I was in a situation where they weren't following the IFU of the gown. And believe it or not, gowns have IFUs. And what was happening is, because they were spending the 20 minutes putting steam tape and all these things that they were using off-label, they were pulling at a certain area of the gown, which weren't supposed to do, and it was ripping. So what did everybody do? Well, they just rip. They're bad. They're cheap. And they weren't cheap. And it's because they were pulling it a certain way because they were making the whole loop and taping and pulling it. It wasn't made for that. So that was one of the things that stood out. And of course, the sizes, having the right size. But something to remember too, that TR11 does go over when you're looking at the assessment that periodically you should be reassessing the protective barriers every 2 years. That's something else, because think about it. Within a year, you change staff. Now imagine every 2 years. And then people get used to it. So you know how that goes, right? In your mock surveys, they get used to it and it's not a problem anymore because they solved it. And you go in there like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? And they're like, oh, we've been doing that for years, So that's just something I want to bring up. But that does stand out for me, is not using it the right way.
Yeah, and Sharon, I think too, just reassessing the protective barriers, and then also, just following the IFUs, I think is really important, because we can become very laxed in those processes when we do it very often.
And I love that we keep throwing in the TIR11 document. It is such a great resource. So if you haven't gotten TIR11 yet, or you haven't read it, I think you've seen now that it is such a great resource to have. Really looking at how are you assessing and reassessing the PPE that you have in your sterile processing department. And it's completely okay if you're listening to this and thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I don't think we've ever done that, because now this is your chance to really make this program that you have into your own and assess as you wish. Please pull in your IP and really use the TIR11 as your guide. I think this is a great chance for everybody to realize what they should be doing and to do what's safest for their team members. And I'm going to wrap it up with a last question. And this is something that I have had various answers as I've gone around speaking to various groups. But the way that we train and do orientation with new team members in sterile processing is really varying around the country as far as what I have assessed. And really it varies as far as what we do with nurses, techs, and really everybody. So I'm not surprised to hear that with sterile processing, it also is a little varying as well. So I'd like to know what you guys have heard, what you think should happen, and what you think really could be best practices that we develop as far as training, as far as what we're seeing with fitting people in the best fit, in the best sizes, and really with orientation in general with what we should be doing with PPE. And Marianne, why don't we just start with you?
I was thinking about how whenever people have the training, there's just so many different learning types out there. And oftentimes we tend to gravitate towards like a presentation, and it becomes a PowerPoint and something that honestly staff probably click through. So there's not a lot of engagement in that conversation. So they actually don't really learn from presentation slides. I think a step up from that would be just adding a video in or something interactive. And then obviously the gold tier for me would be in-person demonstrations on teaching, donning, and doffing. That's the most important thing. And it doesn't matter who's putting the PPE on. They need to have that teach back moment with us, so that way we know that they know how they're doing it and if it's being done correctly, which is really important, especially with the doffing. The doffing, you've already been exposed to all those things. And I guess if you didn't don correctly either, it's going to become an exposure for yourself. So it's just like full circle. And I was listening just the other day, just about like safety podcasts, and just talking about how some areas outside of healthcare, they're like, oh, we fit people to their PPE. We make sure that they have the size that they need and the eyewear. And I'm thinking, oh no, we have a lot of standardized stuff that Sharon mentioned. I mean, may not be, your size is not available there. Maybe you have broader shoulders. Maybe you're taller. Maybe you're smaller and the gown doesn't fit you right. And it's important that when you're onboarding somebody, that you're asking those questions and maybe fitting them at that time. So that way they know at the beginning what they need to have whenever they walk in there and what to do if they don't have what they need moving forward.
Marianne, no, I think that's a great point too. I like how you mentioned the donning and doffing piece, because I think, in terms of just like demonstrations, I think the in-person demonstrations are really important to do. I think it's better to do like you want to make sure that you're actually improving that person's understanding of how to utilize that PPE. So I think, doing that in person is the best way to do it over virtual or some other way. What do you think, Jill?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about it being as important as an N95 fit test. You don't want to go in and just pick any N95 of any size. But when you're working at a decon sink, you want to make sure that everything fits you, just like you would going into a TB room. You want the N95 mask to be the one that fits you appropriately. And Sharon, if you wouldn't mind wrapping us up with talking a little bit about strike-through and how important it is to have the proper PPE and wanting to prevent strike-through and how important that can be.
Yeah, strike-through is pretty big, and it happens quite frequently in decontam. I know that I was pretty wild in decontam. I mean, if there wasn't a lake around me, then I wasn't doing my job, and the strike-throughs, you're leaning against the sink. So, in your selection, not just the level, you need to look at just the type of PPE itself. Like, is it a thick plastic apron type? Or I'm seeing people wear two different types of PPE because they're getting strike through from the underneath, especially when you're leaning against the sink. And again, you're spending another 20 minutes trying to make a nest. I call it the nest. So you're getting a blanket, you're rolling it up, you're taping it to the sink, and it's wrong, like wrong in so many levels. But it's because you're getting strike through. And that goes on your scrubs. And I know, and I've seen it in my career where you don't know until the next break and you were exposed to God knows what in the chemistry. And then I've seen techs not change their scrub, like, but that's going on your body. So strike through is so important, but I think, and I can't speak for all technicians, but in my career, I have seen technicians take it lightly and not taking it serious enough that maybe you actually need to take a shower. I mean, there's showers in locker rooms that just collect dust and that's it. But maybe at times, you might need to. It's a very, it's an area that is very physical, and it's just a gown that is not made to kind of keep up with those bending and twisting and lifting. And then you have loaner trays that rip your gown and you don't know it. So strike through to me is very important safety wise.
And you made such a great point. I want to wrap this up with your point about it's not just bloodborne pathogens that we're concerned with. It's also the chemistries and the chemicals that you're wanting to make sure that you're protected from. So that's such a good point we hadn't made yet. So thank you for making that. And with that, we are out of time on this episode. I want to give a special thank you to Marianne and Sharon, our special guests, and to my co-host, Paul. Thank you to everybody listening to this episode of Pathogens and PPE, and we will see you next time.
All right, so that was a great session. Some of the key takeaways from that is I loved how Sharon and Mary actually talked about the PB70 and how that sets a minimum for the performance of surgical gouge, which is a standard for AAMI Level 3.
And it was great to hear the ideas for collaboration between IP and SPD. I always love talking about risk assessments and working together to really make sure that we're doing the right thing, we're wearing the right thing, and at the right times, and really talking about normalizing safety events and reporting things, escalating things when PPE isn't working well so that we can make sure everybody stays safe at all times and that we're empowering our sterile processing technicians to report things up.
So as always, don't forget to wash your hands.
And keep fighting dirty.
Thanks for tuning in to this exclusive podcast series on pathogens and PPE. For more information and clinical resources to help you fight dirty, make sure to follow us on social media by searching for Beyond Clean and Transmission Control.